Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. I hope my phone stays up to the expectations. Let's see. As Jim mentioned, this is really an experiment for us. So what we really would like to do is have this as an interactive process. So while we have had a list of questions that came in that you guys have already sent to us, and we will try to go through most of them. And as Aly and Helen explain their answers, we would really like you to also get in the discussion, see whether they answer your specific questions. If you have any follow-up questions, please send it as Aly and Helen are speaking so that we can try to address those questions. And please make sure that you send those questions to the chat with everyone so that we can all see. Anyways, let's get the ball rolling. So one of the first questions that we've had is, how do I, in a simple way, measure and share results beyond numbers with a team? So this is really like, when you get information from the field, like, what do you make of the numbers and how do you use it in an organization? I'll throw the question first at Helen because she manages the program. Helen, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Nabonita. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everyone, for being here. This is a nice topic for me. I enjoy talking about RM, and that's a key point, I think, to answering this question, because we try to make results measurement a positive and happy experience across the entire team and across the entire program. And it's very important that for us that everybody is bought into the results measurement system and they, get something out of it. So for me, motivation is the first way to make sure that things are shared and used, the data that's collected, that it's part of everybody's job and everybody's responsibility. I mean, secondly, we have tools and ways for doing that. I'm going to mention more of them in answering some of the other questions, but one thing I would mention here is that we have something called a monitoring action plan meeting, which is held bi-monthly and which includes all members of the results measurement team plus any program officers and senior management. And any data that's collected repetitively for interventions is looked at in real time in those meetings. And that really, really provides a forum where we all discuss it together, really look at the data, what's coming in. And of course, it's not just numbers then, because you're asking, well, why is this number like this? And then we start discussing qualitative factors as well. So that then you get a really good picture built up. And of course, it also adds to, the communication between the different members of the team. So I'd cite that as a main example of, yes, sharing and getting things beyond numbers. Thank you.
Aly, would you like to add to that?
Yes. Let me just add a little more on the side of how do we actually structure reflection sessions where we can actually share what we found in terms of results, be that both quantitative and qualitative, which is really critical, and then use that as a mechanism to make decisions. I hope everybody can see the slides that I just put up. What this shows is that you've got different levels in a program, and you've got a portfolio level, which is your whole program. Programs that are more than one sector will then have a sector level and intervention levels, which is really where the rubber hits the road. And typically when you plan, you start out with your overall program, then you go down to sector strategies and intervention level. But in the process that Helen is talking about in terms of reflecting, you go the other way. And frequent meetings at the intervention level to think about, well, how are things going? What sorts of information are we finding out from the field? What are our attitudes changing? Is behaviors changing? Why not? And that helps you think about how to adjust the intervention or to expand it or drop it if it's not going well. That feeds into the sector level where you have those meetings at the more strategic sector level, and that feeds into your overall portfolio level. So I think it's really important in your MRM system to have those levels clearly defined, and very important to have those meetings regularly to discuss how things are going and and then bring in those results from the field and then make decisions on them.
So I think both Aly and Helen really, really emphasize this point of like having a learning culture. One thing I wanted to mention is also that like throughout this discussion, I think Aly and Helen will also refer to useful resources or like links which we already have to material that you can find online. And what we'll do is that after this webinar, we will send you a list of useful documents pertaining to the topics that we discussed today. Again, like feel free to post your questions as you hear the discussion, just to add if you have any, if you want to gain any clarity on any of the topics. Okay, moving on to the next question, we have another question which is building onto this point. It is how can so this is really at the start of the project, like how can my project design reflect over results measurement? So how do you ensure that this learning culture or this this thing about reflecting on what you find from the field, how is this built into the design of a project? Helen, do you again want to have a start at this?
Thanks, Benita. Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think you'll have more success the earlier you can get results measurement and the ethos of a learning culture into the design. So if you are lucky enough to be in the project design phase, including perhaps proposal writing, you then have a chance to really structure the RM system, how you're going to do it, the ethos of it. You can put that through into the proposal document. Another thing to consider here as well is knowing what your donor's attitude is towards results measurement and how they're supporting it and what their views on it are, because that relationship with your donor is important in being able to build the kind of system that you need. I would cite as an example my donor at the moment, which is SDC, Swiss Development Corporation. They have worked quite, they've been a supporter of, well, the DCED Standard for a long time, and they came up with something great, which was a couple of years ago now, which was where it was several guides for the actual SDC program managers and how they should help manage certain types of program, and also those wanting to implement the DCED Standard. I think it's very much worth those in charge or who have something to do with program design to make sure they've read those kind of documents coming from donors, so they understand what is possible and what not, what the general sort of thinking is in terms of results measurement. Then you can make the most of it. We've made sure that RM, how do you make sure RM is in everything, that everybody knows they're responsible for it? Because RM, of course, is not really separate from program implementation in the sense that once you get the good results, you feed those into your program, management, and it's iterative, and round it goes. And, we're going to talk about systemic change later, and unless you have that thorough knowledge of what's going on the ground, what the numbers are, how you can affect them, how you can calibrate your interventions, then you won't be able to manage to make systemic change happen properly or be able to measure it. So a simple way I can say of making that sort of ownership and work is by putting it in job descriptions, making sure it's quite easy to have the sort of business development officer type of role be solely programmatic. We've always made a big effort to make sure that data management and these sort of interactive meetings that we have, the monitoring action plan meetings, this is all written down in the job description. And also, as is women's economic empowerment related things, all the things we want to be considered by a person, we make sure they're in the job description.
Aly, is there something you would like to add to Helen's answer?
Just a couple of resources that I would encourage everybody to look at on this point. One is Experiences in M&E to Date by Peter Rogerkamp from CAVAC. And another is Using Information on Results in Program Management from the case of Samarth and MDP in Nepal. And Navneeta will send those out. A couple of really good examples of how to do this in action. Also, I got one message saying that somebody can't hear me well, so please do let me know if it's getting better.
I think it is quite clear now, so hopefully it will stay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay, yeah, as Aly says, like I will send over these resources after the webinar today. Then moving on, we have a specific results measurement related question, which is this is something actually which has come up to us time and again, not only in the webinar. We have had this question come up in seminars. This asks, is quasi-experimental design with control groups the most efficient way for measuring impact? So are there other methods that can be used which are just as good in measuring results, and can that be credible? I will ask Aly to take a lead on this one.
All righty, I'm going to change the slide here. This was a framework put together a few years ago to help people get through this question. I think it's choosing the appropriate attribution method is one of the things that lots of practitioners struggle with. And this is a simple sort of yes-no framework to help you get through it. And it's in a paper which Navneeta will send out. But essentially, the answer to the question is, it depends. You shouldn't always use the same attribution method because it depends on what the circumstances are on the ground. And the most important question to start with is, are there other things besides your intervention that influence whatever it is you're trying to influence? So, for example, the productivity of farmers. And if nothing else influences it, then you don't need to compare it to anything else. But if there are things that influence it, like weather and agriculture, then you need to think about a comparison. But there's lots of different ways to do that. So I just want to give a couple of examples. I won't go through the whole framework, but just to give a couple of examples of the sorts of things I'm talking about. So sometimes when it's perfectly fine to just do a before and after comparison with opinion, which is by short called BACO. This is often the case with the changes in your immediate partner. So you're working with a firm who is going to maybe offer services to micro entrepreneurs or whatever, and that's your immediate partner. And obviously, it's impossible to find another, well, it's not impossible. It's very difficult to find an easy comparator to that. But you often don't need to, because while, yes, there are other things that influence those partners, it's likely that within the span of whatever your partnership is working on, that your influence is very, very big compared to other influences. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if you take the whole business, but if you just take the part that you're working on with your partner. So many people just use before and after comparison with opinion when looking at their immediate partners. And I want to emphasize the opinion part here, because people get stuck on measuring just the quantitative change, like how many services they sell or how many beneficiaries did they reach, and they forget to look at what actually changed in their behavior and why, and to ask them why. And those why questions are so critical in all of this. No matter what other statistical tools you use, you always need to be asking those why questions and using qualitative information to understand why things are changing. You might also find that there are other things that influence, but they can be isolated. So let me give you an example from Indonesia, where I worked with a program that was working in the tofu sector. So this was vendors on the street who were making tofu, fried tofu to sell. And there were obviously a lot of things that were affecting their businesses besides the project. But the reality was, overwhelmingly, the most important thing in their performance in terms of the profitability was the cost of the inputs for the tofu. And that was easy enough to track and to isolate. So they didn't need to actually have a comparison with a control group, because they could just isolate that one key factor, which was the other main factor besides the project that was influencing the profitability of those businesses. Another thing to remember is when you do need to compare your beneficiaries or the beneficiaries from the project with others, This doesn't always have to be primary data. Sometimes you can find secondary data. For example, the Thai German Enterprise Competitiveness Program was working in the mango sector, and there was a university that was doing a big study of mangoes, and they were gathering performance data from all the farmers in the area. So this was a big data set that they could use as a comparison for their quite small pilot group. So it's always worth looking at that as a possible option. It doesn't always work, but it can be an option. And so on down the framework. So my point is that using control groups or a quasi-experimental design is one option, but should be used when it's appropriate. And there's a lot of other options to look through. And as I said, the worst mistake is to always choose the same one. And the second worst mistake is to just look at the quantitative side and forget that you also need, whatever method you use, to get qualitative information on what sorts of behavior changes are happening and why those are happening.
Yeah, I think Aly makes a great point. And one of the things, just to like add a little bit to what Aly said, is that like the first step towards establishing attribution is really looking at your results chain and checking, like, you know, are the steps happening? Just asking yourself, why did that change happen? Is it happening because of what I had, because of my activities? So proving all the steps of the results, and it doesn't always necessarily need to be quasi-experimental design at the beneficiary level. You need to look at the context and see what can be a good method to answer your questions, and qualitative data as well as even like secondary information can always be good sources. Again, as Aly mentioned, we will share all the resources that we have which point you towards other methods that can be used after the webinar. Moving on to our next question, we have a question which is on extrapolation. So it is a question that how do you get credible results and how to generalize? So specifically, how can you extrapolate results from smaller samples to apply to bigger populations? So this is something I think like a lot of programs face, specifically when you work in a lot of different areas and you have limitations in terms of budget resources and human resources on how far you can go. So how can you actually extrapolate like data from doing a measurement in a certain area? Could you actually use it to make a more general, form a more general picture of your entire target population of beneficiaries? Aly, I'll hand this one over to you.
Okay, just to start out again with the point that Nabanita was making, but before you start thinking about sampling, in terms of getting credible results, the first place to start is your results chain to check and to assess whether each of those changes are actually happening. But when you get to a level where you've got a larger population, say 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 or however big it is, then you get to a stage where you can actually measure a sample of either businesses or beneficiaries, depending on what you're looking at, and then extrapolate that to the wider population. And the trick here is to think about your sampling quite carefully. So I wanted to show a couple of things. The first is that actually the thing that people jump to is sample size. But it doesn't matter what sample size you get if you don't actually construct your sample to represent the population that you're talking about. So you need to think about questions like, who can actually tell you what you need to know? Who represents the population? What is the size of the population? How big are the differences between people likely to be? Are people within the population quite similar with respect to productivity or profits or whatever you're trying to measure? Or are they quite different? How big is the change that you expect? Are you expecting a 2% increase in productivity or a 100% increase in productivity? What's the context? And if you've got different contexts, for example, does it matter whether people are close to a road or far from a road? Does it matter if they're women or men? Does it matter if they're a big family or a small family? And that helps you also think about categories of people who might be in different circumstances that you want to sample separately. So asking who you want to actually put into your sample is as critical as the size of it. And actually, how are you going to find and choose those respondents? So how are you going to get, if you need a random sample or a purposive sample, how are you going to get that? Then just moving on to just a very quick thing on the different types of sampling. Everybody often obviously thinks, oh, it must be only random. But actually, depending on the type of information you're trying to get, there are also some circumstances where you might want to use purposive sampling, which is actually getting people who you think are going to be most likely to be able to answer a question. So sometimes that can be snowball, which is you ask one person you're interviewing to recommend somebody else, or it can be a quota based on if you know what the population looks like, you can also divide your sample in a similar way. Or there's random sampling, and then you have to figure out how to do that. Do you have a list of the people that in the population, or can you do a random sample by area and then choose every few houses, etc. So you have to choose your type of sampling. And we have some help with this that I just wanted to point to because people do struggle with it. There's concepts like confidence level, which is the likelihood that another sample will provide the same result, and the margin of error, which means your answer is plus or minus what. But to get through this for us non-statisticians, the DCED has actually put a sample size calculator, which helps you think through these issues on their website. Asks you a series of questions in order to help you determine an appropriate sample size. But I just want to close this again with, don't get so hung up on the sample size that you forget also the other mechanisms to ensure that your information is credible. And the best one in that is triangulation. So don't just ask only farmers, but if you want to find out what farmers are doing, then ask the suppliers to the farmers, the buyers from the farmers, so you're getting different perspectives, asking different types of farmers. And that triangulation of asking different types of market actors and different types of actors within the sample will really help improve your credibility as well, not just the sample size.
Thanks, Aly. I think just, I really liked also like the first point Aly mentioned about this snowballing. I myself, like in my work, I found it often useful when working in projects that if you start by, building on your sample, it becomes easier. So when you make monitoring visits, if intervention managers are in the field, if they talk with 2 people in an area, have that, record that, and use it to add to your sample. Build the case as you come along, because in the end you see then the sample size also keeps increasing, and it makes you form a better picture of what is happening as a result of work. Okay, moving on, we have some questions we have 2 specific questions related to systemic change, which I will ask both Helen and Aly to answer. The first question we have is that, are there different models for measuring systemic change? So this is quite a broad question. Maybe Helen, you can start by giving a project view, your view on that, what ALCP uses.
Hi, yeah, I will. And I think Aly's got some pictures to put up for me. Here we are. Here's the first one. I thought I'd basically give an example of how we're doing it, because it's a real-time example. We thought long and hard about how to do it when it started happening, because that's the other thing. It's not happening from the beginning, obviously, in a project. And if you're lucky enough to have got it going and have the time to measure it, the length of project, then it's an interesting thing in that one of the things I found was I had to push, very hard and repeatedly, my RM team to measure it. It's a sort of funny preconception somehow that crowding in isn't real or isn't quite as valid, perhaps, as the sort of direct number coming from, direct program clients. So that was the first hurdle, to get everybody to take it seriously and to make sure it was being attributed to the program, and then to map it. Because of course, by its very nature, because it's away from your direct intervention, so it's going out geographically usually as well. You have to map it in some way, and we did that through that was when our use of infographics got really serious. We'd always been serious because we'd wanted to contextualize numbers, and we use infographics all the time to do this, because it's sort of getting the maximum information across in one thing. But when it comes to systemic change, that's when you really need infographics. On our program website, we have, on the Our Program page down the bottom, there's loads of infographics on there if anybody wants to see an example of this. So, yes, I've talked about, getting everybody in the right mindset to capture it, and mapping it and showing it. That's all very well. However, how do you do that? So this web, this spider's web effect diagram, is meant to represent really what I see as the fundamental way, the practical way to capture it. So if the program team has been fully involved both in RM and, of course, market research, going out, mapping market players, getting to know, with full market research and market intelligence, which is ongoing, they will have developed over time a network of contacts. And information, of course, is huge in any kind of programming, and knowing what's going on, when it's going on. So this builds up this organic web of contacts, and it's this web which is going to be the mechanism by which one captures systemic change. Change is happening in the system. Be they another business copying the model, be they, changes at a political level, regulations that have changed because of work you've done, be they a business expanding, and in an unusual way, but in a way that is attributable to you. This is this on the ground web. And I mean, I will extend the metaphor further. So the systemic instance of systemic change can be like a fly in the outer reaches of the web, and the filaments tremble, and then somebody on the team picks it up. That's the important part, because it can be difficult to pick up, and it requires this constant monitoring. But it's no different to me to the concept of ongoing market intelligence. It's part and parcel of the same thing. So if I won't bang the drum on that one anymore, I'll go to the next slide. So if the network of contacts, the web, is the sort of means of doing it, the action that is also required is the active trawling for it. Unlike the spider, and this is where the metaphor ends, you can't just sit in your web waiting for it to happen. There are also times when you use, as Ali and Nabanita were just saying, you have expectations anyway. Recently, I've been talking to people about this idea of unintended effects, whether there is such a thing sometimes as an unintended effect, or just an undefined one. To me, quite a bit of systemic change is undefined. It's not an unfeasible thing that some of these changes are happening given what you've managed to do in a sector, let's say. They're just maybe not written down in a results chain, because to do that, these results chain they just basically wouldn't fit on the page, which is what we're limited by. So one always has to be aware of what might be happening out there, and because you've got your web, you're in tune, and then you actively trawl, hence the diagram. You trawl for changes you're kind of expecting to see, and then you might pick up some unexpected ones too. So that's it, really. I mean, we do then, in discussions of what we have found, we do reference the AAER framework, which was a tool developed some time ago. I'm going to get it wrong, and that's the awful thing. Adopt, adapt, expand, respond. We do use that as a sort of, we discussed that, but I wouldn't call that, it's not our tool. So it's more this activity and the knowledge. And then, but we do have a tool which we use to feed it then into the system, which Ali is going to scroll onto, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
sorry.
So we
Yep,
have
there we go.
something called, here we go. Sorry, Ali, I've gone completely out of the thing.
Nope. Yeah, I've got you. There it is.
This is what we call our systemic change log. So absolutely a log sheet. Ali is going to go over the principles of what you're actually collecting when you do this. This is our tool for, you know, the intervention it's linked to, the type of systemic change. We tend to have three: crowding in, business expansion, and sectoral change. And we also, the farmers, the copying in is measured in a different way. We have a second monitoring plan, which is purely qualitative, and we pick up our farmer level changes there and in larger level surveys. But on here, it's crowding in, business expansion, or sectoral change. And as you see here, this is where it has to be. This goes through quite a lot of people. It's verified and checked through a lot of people. And it's a very public document, to the point which this is included in the biannual donor report, and all our reports are online, and you know, so it can be clicked on and found very easily. So I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Helen. That was really useful. I found the spider web actually quite, it gives a nice comprehensive picture of all the different things you need to look at. Aly, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the frameworks and also the issue of attribution and systemic change, which everybody finds a difficult one. In terms of, there are a number of frameworks out there. There's the AAER one that Helen mentioned. There's also some different frameworks that programs have put together. Market Development Facility has one. Other programs have put together their own frameworks. And there's a lot of experimentation with frameworks that look more at that sectoral level that Helen was talking about. And I think that's really where the edge of the envelope is thinking about, rather than systemic change coming from individual interventions, how do we look at that overall sectoral change? But going back to the issue of assessing systemic change, because this is, I think this is one that people struggle with, because as Helen said, we are reluctant to take credit for things if we're not reasonably sure they had something to do with us. Or sometimes programs go the other way and they're quite keen to take credit for everything, whether or not it did have anything to do with them. So how do we find our way through this when obviously you're more, the methods I talked about earlier aren't going to be appropriate. You cannot have a control system, another whole system that you look at to see if it's, you know, compare it with your system. So this is a much more qualitative assessment of attribution. And a guideline was put together several years ago by the DCED to look at, well, what do we actually require for assessing attribution in systemic change? The first is a pathway that you have actually outlined how you expect a sector to change or systemic change to happen. Now, I want to emphasize what Helen said. This doesn't mean every single detail, like we expect this business and this business and this is a crowding in and we think this regulation is going to change, etc. This is more generally what sorts of changes are you expecting to happen. So typically programs achieve this by putting together some kind of a sector strategy or sector result or sector results chain that outlines the sorts of systemic changes that they're expecting and how they expect their interventions and their strategies to influence those changes. The next is evidence of change, which Helen talked about. You actually have to go out and see what is changing in the sector. So have government regulations changed? Have other businesses changed their practice? What are other farmers doing? All those sorts of changes, you have to go out there and actually assess those changes. Next one is where it gets tricky, and that's evidence of causal links. Now, I have a lot of practitioners come to me and say, well, you know, we went to a business and we're darn sure that they copy because they're doing exactly the same thing as the one that we worked with. But when we asked them, they said, oh, no, it was my own idea. Well, of course they did. You know, they're not going to say, yes, I copied the business, my competitor down the street. So that's not required that a business would say point blank, oh, absolutely, I copied the business down the street. We have to be a little bit more investigative, like a reporter who will go and sleuth out the connections. So the first thing is to look at the timing. Obviously, you would expect behavior changes that are indirect to happen after direct changes. The next is you can look at things like the similarity of the business models if you're looking at crowding in. Can we see key things which are the same? A critical one is the plausible flow of information. Is there a way that those we think have been influenced could have gotten information from the direct changes? And the last is to just get out there and ask opinions. Ask key stakeholders. That web that Helen was showing, ask lots and lots of people opinions about why things are changing. And you'll get a lot of different answers, but what you're listening for is things that are linked to your intervention as well as things that aren't. And that brings me to the last one, and that's consideration of alternative causes of change. So it's very easy to just say, oh, well, the only thing that might have influenced this is our intervention. But we have to actually look for other things that might have influenced change, like new roads, changes in policy regulations, growth of the sector that's not because of us, increased exports or increased imports of key things, entry of big businesses. So those sorts of things that also might be influencing, we have to look at those and ask about those as well. So we're comparing the influence or getting information on the influence of other things compared to the work that we've done as well. And out of that, you don't always get something ironclad, but you get a reasonable idea of the influence of your project. And that's critical not just for reporting, but also for management, because it helps you understand how to influence more. But in the terms of reporting, it gives you a qualitative story to tell about how you've influenced change, and sometimes quantitative information as well, as shown in the log that Helen put up.
Thank you for that, Aly. I think that also answers the question on whether can you measure attribution for seeing this sector-wide transformation, or is it really can you look into contribution? Do you maybe Helen, do you have any other examples which you would want to share for this, where you've looked into contribution specifically for assessing systemic change?
You're going to have to explain. I think it's worth explaining this idea of contribution rather than attribution. I think it's sort of worth explaining that first.
Yeah, I'll tackle that one. Yeah, it's actually, I think, more of a continuum than we like to admit. Because what we're trying to understand is, why did change happen, and what were the things that contributed to it. And frankly, there's almost always something else that contributed to it, even if it's only an entrepreneur's own, entrepreneurialism. But it's trying to understand, if you can get an answer to the question that how do we actually isolate the change that would have not happened or would have happened with this intervention compared to would have not happened without the intervention, then we're looking at attribution. If we're more in the realm of, well, how did our project combine with other things like new roads and changes in government regulation, etc., to influence change, then you're talking about contribution.
Yeah, so I think the way you get around this really is by sort of, there's a point at which attributing numbers in this case to your sort of against targets of your log frame would be a bit weird. However, with this idea that it's a continuum, and with this, if you have the tracking systems in place and you have the causality tracked, logged, and you can then say, well, you can present this as a picture, and then it's sort of up to your viewer in a way how much they say they credit to you. I don't think many people would expect a program presenting a detailed view of sectoral changes would assume they're claiming to have changed the whole thing by themselves. But it's part of the role of a program that is helping cause sectoral change, that they pick up on it and they present it and they examine it and they discuss it. Because that's, well, in your examination of the change itself, you will build up a great picture of it, and that is very, very useful. And then you can isolate your role within it. I mean, we've just had I have a specific example actually, which we've just tracked. We had a machinery intervention for haymaking machinery, which included an in-store credit component within the machinery shops, and was a bit slow really in realizing that the bank, former MFI and now bank, which has a representative sitting in the shop providing the loans, has taken this model and is now providing loans to farmers through input supply shops, and of course across the whole of Georgia. And it's spreading also into Armenia. And I was wondering, you know, how much of that was us? I mean, wouldn't that be cool if it was that thing that we did, which spread it across the whole of Georgia, because this is an immense amount of money. The picture's, of course, not that clear on interviewing the business, interviewing the bank, the microfinance institution, interviewing, you know, people who were also not directly connected with us but have this facility. Seemed like we were a pretty big part of it, but certainly not the whole thing. And as you say, Ali, a lot of it's to do with time. We used the time thing to really give us an idea. So I can say we were a strong influencing factor, because the two businesses that we had, the big veterinary pharmacy one and these machinery input supply shops, are like the two best clients. However, at the same time, that bank was looking for a way to expand its microloans portfolio, which was basically, you know, it's saturated. So the two things happened at the same time, and yeah, I think we can. So we present that information, state our part in it, and leave the rest for everybody to say, okay, well, yeah, great.
Thank you for that, Ellen. That really gives a good example of like where you really think about like who else is also, you know, how others have also contributed. You don't claim it fully yourself, because there are all these other influencing factors when you work in market systems development. Moving on to a different topic now, we've had this broader question come up from a few people, was that whether you can actually apply the standard in different development approaches. And one specific one came about, can you apply the standard in the shelter sector? And actually, we have the person who asked the question, Jason Catter. He's in the webinar, so we're going to ask him to maybe explain this question a bit more specifically, and then maybe Ali, you and Helen can have a go at it. Jason, I'll pass it on to you.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I actually have to revise my question, because the answer is yes, I think the standard can be applied in any sector. I guess my question really is, how can it be applied in the shelter sector? So I am with Habitat for Humanity, and I'm new to the organization, barely 1 year. I came from agriculture and the humanitarian field, and involved in various market systems development work in the past already. Most of the samples I hear are really from the agriculture sector, and some in the wash sector and in the food sector. Very rare to hear anything related to shelter or housing in particular. Housing in itself is constructing it is a system in itself of material, labor, and finance, in breaking down the material into major components like roof, walls, etc., etc. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, are there any similar sectors that is close to the housing sector in terms of its characteristics that we can get lessons from in terms of applying resource management? Right now, all I can think of is the wash sector. So I'm not sure if my question is making sense, but well, my excuse is it's already late at night in the Philippines right now.
Should I take a stab at that one?
Yeah, Aly, please.
As you said, that the basic building blocks of the DCE results measurement standard are just basic good practice and results measurement. They are actually not sector specific and they're not even specific to economic programs. So, I've just put these up on the screen, the 7 sections of the standard, and they are really applicable across any type of program. In fact, we have, as you say, seen them applied outside of economic opportunities programs. We've seen them applied in governance and WASH, et cetera, because they're basic practices. But you obviously have to customize it to whatever sector you're doing. So you make a results chain, but at the top of the results chain isn't necessarily for shelter, isn't going to be increased income. It's going to be maybe more houses built or more sales of houses or whatever might be at the top of a results chain that's focused on shelter. Probably I would think something like number of families housed or something like that. So the concept of laying out the steps between what you're doing and what you expect to happen in the roofing market and the changes in the flooring and how that's going to come together to actually house more people is the steps you would take to articulate a results chain for the shelter sector. And it's the same when you go through all the different steps. It's a matter of thinking through how it applies in housing. Having said that, you are absolutely right that most of our examples are in more classic private sector development programs. So in, finance and agriculture and, business enabling environment and skills development and that kind of thing. So we don't have very many examples in other sectors. And I'd like to throw that one open to the group if anybody has examples from other sectors that they think would be similar to housing.
Thank you for that. Extremely useful.
Jason, I think you muted yourself, or?
Oh, I said very, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. I also wanted to say that our next, I think what Aly is saying, that broader components of the standard, you need to, of course, and think about in your results chain and in your measurement how to think about your specific work and how to build it. But I guess the broader answer is that yes, you can think about how to apply the standard in different sectors. In fact, our next webinar is going to be also on how to apply the standard in financial inclusion. So we also welcome everybody here to, if you have specific examples from applying the standard or even making result chains in different sectors, please do write to us because I think the entire community benefits from this.
There's a question in the chat box, I think, related to the one we were talking about before on systemic change. How can we ensure a theory of change is exhaustive to ensure that we do not miss any pathway to change?
Yeah, Aly, that's a good one.
I can start on that one.
Yes, I think that would be good.
The answer is you can't. I know that sounds a bit horrible, and maybe Helen can add to this, but the thing is that a theory of change is nothing more than your best guess based on what you're going to do about what's going to happen. And it absolutely will not be exhaustive. And that's why it's so critical, as Helen said, to have that web out there and to start seeing maybe other things that are happening and how your program may or may not have influenced them. And then you can incorporate that into your theory of change as you go along. So I think it's impossible to know everything that's going to happen when you first start. And that's why it's really critical that your results change, whether they're at program or sector, especially at sector and intervention level, are things that you revisit and change as you go along. Because some things you expected to happen won't happen, either at the sector or the intervention level, and some things you didn't expect to happen will happen, and that should be incorporated as you go along.
Gordon, does that answer your question? Oh, we can't hear you, but like if you have any further questions, maybe you can use the chat box.
I mean, also I can come in on that one, Benita, as well. I mean,
Yeah.
this, again, it makes, as Ali says.
Yes, that's helpful.
Yeah. The net thing is absolutely imperative. You know, that the contact is there with the surroundings. But I think also, if you know that you've got the web in place, and if you know that you have your results change, your sectoral results change, you've got a good working ethos going on in your program where RM people are talking properly with program people and the results are iterative, then I think you can kind of, and you have tools to capture it, I think you can kind of relax to a certain extent. And then I mentioned earlier, I don't know how many people have gotten their sort of donor reports or something like that, this unintended effects. This is used sometimes to give you a section where you can write about kind of weird stuff that happened, but it's good, and it sort of could be attributed to you, but not quite, because it's not down in your results chain. This is why I changed my thinking over this, because the more we were scrabbling around looking for something that was truly unintended, because what we found was, because of what we were doing and how we were doing it in a very comprehensive way, something might happen that was indeed undefined, i.e. it wasn't particularly in the sectoral results chain, or only in a very kind of rather broad way, because sectoral results chains tend to be pretty broad. But you couldn't really call it unintended. And I think it's okay to relax a bit and say, well, that's cool. You know, we can't map everything, but we can collect it. We can then write it down, examine it, research it, find it interesting, and add it to our store of knowledge and present it to people like visitors or donors as part of the picture of what the program is achieving.
Thanks a lot for that, Helen. That was really useful. We're rounding the corner. We're rounding our hour right now, so I will just take one last question, which is from Hemat, and he had this question on how can you reduce costs, how can you reduce your measuring cost of monitoring. So I will pass it, I will ask Hemat to maybe be a bit more specific, and if you can ask us like in reducing cost in terms of like what specific aspect of measurement, and maybe we can ask Helen or Aly, Helen and Aly to try and answer that. Hemat, are you there? I think we might have lost him.
I don't think he's there anymore.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think like.
But it take a stab starting anyway?
Yes. Yeah, Aly.
Okay. I think the real secret to cost effectiveness in measuring results is monitoring. It's getting that regular information through small samples, like maintaining your web, as Helen says, because the biggest mistake I see in terms of waste of money is that programs try and measure the impacts of interventions that obviously weren't successful, and that's a massive waste of money. So the trick is to be monitoring all the time to find out how is it going. And if you have an intervention that didn't work, well, it's critical to find out why it didn't work, but it's not worth trying to measure the impacts. That's just a waste of money. Or if you find out an intervention that worked somewhat, you might want to find out, well, you definitely want to find out why and what's the problem and how can you fix it, what are the behavior changes, to really dig into the qualitative. But in terms of actually measuring impacts, you either want to do that lightly or wait until you've adapted the intervention to be more effective before you measure. And then reserve your most rigorous measurements for those interventions that your monitoring shows have really succeeded and are likely to generate very big impacts. So rather than sort of measuring everything the same, the trick to cost effectiveness is monitoring all the time so you really have a good handle on what's working and what's not. And then gearing your rigorous of measurement for impact to how much impact there likely is. Helen, do you want to add?
I think that was a really great point, actually. And I'd take this back to right in the beginning, we were talking about sampling. And I think that's the other thing as well. It's really saying the same thing as you in many ways, but your monitoring must be fit for purpose. And most people gather repetitive data when they're working like we do with businesses. And in terms of impact assessment, yeah, it can be very difficult. And we've struggled lately with moving from, we used to cluster our supporting functions with core and rules all in one place because the market was so thin. So we had to do all intervention impact assessments. They would be done on a population of all the interventions at the same time. But they were really good. They were very cost effective. Now we've had to move to, you know, interventions that have gone national, some even international. And obviously then it does get more expensive, and we are employing that, Ali, absolutely, which is, well, these are the ones we have to measure. These are the ones we have to prove. And using all kinds of methods available to us, you know, obviously the triangulation, export data, all sorts of things. And then ground truthing with people, obviously, using the qualitative information has to be very, very good quality for each intervention that we measure. And just as a reflection on costs as well, I think this is one of those things which program, again, and donor need to be in accord about. We always, in our discussions with the donor and meetings, you know, make it clear that, you know, our investment in team, in staff members, they are our most valuable resource, and that actually in our RM budget, the highest cost that we have are staff salaries. The other stuff's fairly insignificant, actually. But then anyway, when everybody's involved in RM, it becomes quite difficult to separate it out. But the benefits are absolutely clear. So I think that might be another way of looking at this issue of cost.
And just to add to what Aly and Helen said, we also had a webinar last year in September on, we had 2 programs, specific tips on like how they had in their program tried to reduce costs, what specific tools they used. So I will also share, after the webinar, I'll also share the link to the recording for that webinar because that might also be useful. I think we are in the end now. We've had a lot of questions answered and we hope it was useful for you. We have had some questions also come in which we aren't able to answer right now because I think some questions on like other topics. What would be useful is if you can send us in the feedback form which Lucretia will share with you right now. If you can send us questions related to other specific topics, or if you think that this webinar was useful, we can maybe have another follow-up one where we try to again address specific questions that you have. A big thank you to Aly and Helen. You guys were both, I think it was a very useful discussion. You've shared your experience, you've given specific examples, and I think you've given us, pointed us towards a lot of resources which can be useful, which I'll synthesize and put together in one document and share with this group after the webinar. Thank you everyone for your participation, and we would really like to hear from you whether you found this useful. So please use the form that is shared by DCED in the chat box to let us know how this was, and whether you can give us any feedback on future topics you would like to be interested in sharing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you also from me. Thanks and goodbye.